For 40 years, a boy's blue bicycle lay hidden beneath the dark waters of Miller's Lake, chained and forgotten. When divers finally brought it to the surface, the town of Millbrook was forced to face the truth it had feared since 1965. Danny Morrison was 16 years old in the summer of 1965, and he believed the world was made of endless possibilities. He had that kind of sandy brown hair that caught the sunlight just right when he rode his bicycle, and a smile that could charm the strictest teachers at Millbrook High School. Standing just over 5 feet 8 inches, he was still growing into his frame, all arms and legs and boundless energy that never seemed to find a proper outlet except when he was on his bike. The summer of 1965 was shaping up to be the best of his life. He'd made the varsity basketball team as a junior. His grades were solid enough to make his parents proud, and he'd finally saved enough money from his part-time job at Peterson's grocery store to buy the bicycle he'd been dreaming about for months. The Schwinn Stingray sat in the Morrison family garage like a gleaming trophy, its metallic blue frame catching the light streaming through the dusty windows. Danny had customized it with white wall tires, chrome fenders, and a banana seat that made him feel like he was riding a motorcycle instead of a bicycle. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where mothers called other mothers when their children were 5 minutes late coming home, and where the biggest scandal in recent memory was when Mrs. Patterson's prize roses were trampled by someone's loose dog. Population 3,012, according to the sign at the town limits, nestled on the shores of Miller's Lake in upstate New York. The lake was the town's crown jewel, crystal clear water surrounded by pine trees and rocky outcroppings that provided perfect diving spots for the local teenagers. Frank Morrison owned Morrison Hardware on Main Street, a store that had been in the family for 2 generations. He was a solid man with calloused hands and an honest face, the kind of person neighbors turned to when they needed advice about more than just the right screws for a loose door hinge. Helen Morrison worked as the librarian at Millbrook Elementary, beloved by children and parents alike for her gentle way of introducing young minds to the magic of books. She had soft brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a patience that seemed infinite when dealing with restless children. Susan Morrison was 12 years old and worshipped her older brother with the fierce loyalty that only a younger sister could possess. She followed Danny around whenever he'd let her, begging to ride on the handlebars of his bicycle or to tag along when he met his friends at the lake. Danny tolerated her attention with the good-natured resignation of an older brother who secretly enjoyed being seen as a hero by someone who mattered to him. The Morrison house sat on Elm Street, a white 2-story colonial with green shutters and a wraparound porch where the family gathered on summer evenings to watch the fireflies dance in the growing darkness. Helen maintained a garden in the backyard that was the envy of the neighborhood, rows of tomatoes and beans and flowers that bloomed in careful succession throughout the growing season. It was the kind of home that felt safe, permanent, rooted in the community, like the old oak tree that shaded the front lawn. That summer, Danny had fallen in love with the freedom his bicycle provided. He could ride the winding roads around Miller's Lake, explore the old logging trails that cut through the forest, or race his friends down the steep hill on Prospect Street with the wind whipping through his hair. The Schwinn Stingray wasn't just transportation, it was independence, adventure, the promise that the world was bigger than the boundaries of Millbrook. His friends envied the bike almost as much as they admired Danny's easy confidence. Tommy Chen, whose family had moved to Millbrook from New York City the previous year, often said that Danny could make friends with a lamppost if he put his mind to it. Sarah Williams, who had harbored a secret crush on Danny since 7th grade, loved the way his eyes lit up when he talked about places he wanted to see, roads he wanted to ride, adventures waiting just beyond the horizon. In 1965, the world felt safe and predictable in Millbrook. Children rode their bicycles without helmets, played outside until the streetlights came on, and walked to school without parents worrying about anything more dangerous than scraped knees or hurt feelings. It was a time of innocence, before the evening news brought distant wars and urban violence into small-town living rooms, before parents learned to fear strangers and lock their doors at night. Danny Morrison embodied all of that innocence and optimism. He was the golden boy of his golden summer, riding his gleaming bicycle through streets where everyone knew his name and everyone expected great things from his future. July 23rd, 1965 started like every other summer morning in the Morrison household. Danny woke to the sound of his mother moving around the kitchen below his bedroom, the familiar clatter of dishes and the gentle hum of the coffee percolator that had been their morning soundtrack for as long as he could remember. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom window, promising another perfect day for adventures on his Schwinn Stingray. He found his parents already seated at the kitchen table when he padded downstairs in his pajamas, hair sticking up at odd angles. Frank Morrison sat with his coffee and the morning paper, reading about some distant war in a place called Vietnam that felt as far away as the moon to a 16-year-old boy in upstate New York. Helen Morrison was buttering toast, her hair neatly pinned back and her floral house dress already crisp despite the early hour. "Morning, sleepyhead," his mother said, not looking up from her task but smiling in that way mothers do when they're genuinely happy to see their children. "I made your favorite blueberry pancakes. There's fresh syrup from the Hendersons' farm." Danny's stomach growled in response. Mrs. Henderson made the best maple syrup in 3 counties, and his mother only broke it out for special occasions or when she wanted to make sure her son ate a proper breakfast before disappearing for the day on his bicycle. Susan appeared at the kitchen doorway, already dressed in her favorite summer outfit, a yellow sundress with tiny white flowers that their grandmother had sent from Albany. "Can I come with you today, Danny? Please? I promise I won't slow you down." "Not today, Squirt," Danny said, ruffling her hair as he passed. "Tommy and I are meeting the gang at Miller's Lake. We're going to practice some new tricks before we go swimming, maybe tomorrow." Susan's face fell, but she didn't argue. She'd learned that begging only made Danny more determined to leave her behind, though she never stopped hoping he'd change his mind. Frank Morrison folded his newspaper and looked at his son over his reading glasses. "What kind of tricks are you boys planning?" "Nothing dangerous, I hope." "Just some jumps, Dad. There's this thing called a wheelie where you lift the front wheel and ride on just the back one. I've been practicing in the driveway when you're at the store." Helen Morrison set a plate of steaming pancakes in front of her son, along with a glass of fresh orange juice. "You be careful on that bicycle, Daniel Morrison. I don't want you showing off and getting hurt." "Mom, I'm 16. I can handle a bicycle." 16-year-olds think they can handle everything," she replied, but her tone was gentle, affectionate rather than scolding. "Just remember that skin doesn't grow back as fast as teenage pride heals." Danny demolished the pancakes with the enthusiasm of a growing boy, syrup dripping down his chin as he told his family about his plans for the day. He and Tommy Chen were going to meet Sarah Williams, Mike Peterson, and a few other kids at their usual spot on the north shore of Miller's Lake. The water would be perfect for swimming, and the rocky outcropping nearby provided ideal launching points for bicycle stunts. "I want to master the wheelie before school starts again," Danny explained between bites. "Tommy says his cousin in the city can ride a wheelie for 2 whole blocks." 2 blocks, Frank Morrison repeated, shaking his head with amused disbelief. "In my day, we were happy if our bicycles had 2 wheels that stayed round." After breakfast, Danny bounded upstairs to get dressed, pulling on his favorite pair of cut-off jeans and a white t-shirt that had seen better days but felt perfectly broken in. He grabbed his swimming trunks, wrapping them in a towel, along with a bottle of Coca-Cola his mother had packed for it. The Schwinn Stingray gleamed in the morning sunlight when he wheeled it out of the garage. Danny had spent the previous evening cleaning and polishing it until every chrome surface reflected the sky. He'd adjusted the seat height and checked the tire pressure with the thoroughness of a race car mechanic preparing for the Indianapolis 500. "Be home by 6 for dinner," Helen Morrison called from the front porch, where she stood watching her son prepare for another day of summer adventure. "We're having pot roast, and your father's bringing ice cream from town." "I'll be here, Mom. Promise." Those were the last words Helen Morrison would ever hear her son speak. Danny Morrison climbed onto his beloved bicycle, waved goodbye to his family, and pedaled down Elm Street toward what should have been just another perfect summer day. The morning sun caught the metallic blue of his Schwinn Stingray as he disappeared around the corner, heading toward Miller's Lake and an appointment with destiny that no one could have imagined. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Inside, it's also we've this move you ard. Susan Morrison stood at her bedroom window, watching her brother's figure grow smaller in the distance, wishing once again that he'd let her tag along on his adventures. 6 o'clock came and went without the familiar sound of Danny's bicycle wheels on the gravel driveway. Helen Morrison stood at the kitchen window, stirring the pot roast for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, her eyes scanning Elm Street for any sign of her son's metallic blue Schwinn Stingray. The mashed potatoes were getting cold, and the green beans had long since lost their vibrant color from sitting too long in the warming pot. "Maybe he lost track of time," Frank Morrison said from his seat at the dinner table, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. Danny was many things, but unreliable wasn't one of them. The boy had never missed a family dinner without calling first, not once in his 16 years. Susan pushed the food around on her plate, stealing glances at her brother's empty chair. The dining room felt strangely quiet without Danny's animated stories about his day, his plans for tomorrow, his dreams of riding his bicycle all the way to California someday. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder in his absence. By 6:30, Helen's stirring had become more agitated, the wooden spoon clicking against the sides of the pot with increasing frequency. "Frank, maybe you should drive around and look for him. You know how boys get when they're having fun with their friends. They forget the world exists." Frank Morrison pushed back from the table and reached for his car keys. He'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to appear overprotective. Danny was growing up, becoming more independent, and a father had to learn when to hold tight and when to let go. But something felt different about tonight, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He drove the familiar route from their house to Miller's Lake, windows down, listening for the sound of teenage laughter or the whir of bicycle wheels on pavement. The lake was quiet when he arrived, the water smooth as glass reflecting the early evening sky. A few families were packing up their picnic supplies, but there was no sign of Danny or his friends. Frank approached a middle-aged man loading a cooler into his station wagon. "Excuse me, have you seen a group of teenagers here today? A boy on a blue Schwinn Stingray bicycle?" The man shook his head. "Been here since noon with my kids. Haven't seen any teenagers at all today. Usually this place is crawling with them during the summer." A cold knot began forming in Frank's stomach. He drove slowly back through town, checking the usual hangouts where Danny and his friends might spend their time. Peterson's drugstore, where they bought comic books and shared sodas. The playground behind the elementary school. The old covered bridge where kids sometimes went to feel grown up and important. Nothing. Back home, Helen met him at the door before he could even turn off the car engine. "Did you find him?" "No, but I'm sure he's fine. Let me make some phone calls." Note: the Chen family answered on the second ring. Mrs. Chen's voice was warm and friendly until Frank explained why he was calling. "Tommy's been home all day," she said, concern creeping into her tone. "He's been waiting for Danny to call. They were supposed to meet at the lake, but Danny never showed up." Frank felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "What time were they supposed to meet?" "Around 2 o'clock. Tommy waited until almost 4, then came home. He thought maybe Danny had changed his mind." The next call to the Williams house yielded the same information. Sarah had waited at Miller's Lake until her parents made her come home for dinner. No sign of Danny Morrison or his distinctive bicycle anywhere. By 8 o'clock, Frank had called every family in Danny's circle of friends. The story was always the same. Danny had made plans, but he'd never arrived. No one had seen him since he'd left home that morning with promises to be back by 6. Helen Morrison sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "This isn't like him, Frank. Danny doesn't just disappear. He doesn't break promises." Frank looked at his wife, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. In 1965, children didn't simply vanish from small towns like Millbrook. Bad things happened in big cities, in distant places you read about in newspapers. Not here, not to families like theirs, not to boys like Danny. Susan appeared in the doorway, still wearing her yellow sundress, her face pale with confusion. "Where's Danny, Daddy? Is he in trouble?" Frank Morrison looked at his 12-year-old daughter and realized he didn't have an answer. At 9:30, with the summer darkness finally settling over Millbrook like a blanket, he picked up the telephone and dialed the police station. His hands were shaking as he waited for someone to answer. "Millbrook Police, Chief Hayes speaking." "Chief, this is Frank Morrison. My son Danny is missing." Chief Robert Hayes had been protecting the peace in Millbrook for 12 years, and in all that time, the most serious crime he dealt with was when the Patterson boys had stolen apples from Old Man Henderson's orchard back in 1962. Missing children simply didn't happen in towns like theirs. When Frank Morrison called that July evening, Hayes initially assumed the boy had just lost track of time, maybe fallen asleep by the lake after a long day of swimming and bike riding. But something in Frank's voice made the chief take notice. There was a tremor there, a fear that Hayes recognized from his own days as a father. By the time he arrived at the Morrison house 20 minutes later, that fear had spread to everyone in the room. "When did you last see Danny?" Hayes asked, pulling out a small notebook that rarely saw use for anything more serious than traffic violations. "This morning at breakfast," Helen Morrison replied, her voice steady but her hands shaking as she poured coffee for the chief. "He left around 10 o'clock to meet his friends at Miller's Lake." Hayes wrote down the basic information, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was supposed to do with it. The Millbrook Police Department consisted of himself, 2 part-time deputies, and a secretary who worked 3 days a week. They had 1 patrol car, a radio that worked when the weather was good, and a jail cell that hadn't been used in 5 years. By dawn on July 24th, word had spread through Millbrook with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. The Morrison boy was missing, and that was something that concerned everyone who lived in their safe little community. Before Chief Hayes could organize any kind of official search, volunteers began showing up at the police station. Tom Peterson closed his grocery store and brought sandwiches for the searchers. Martha Chen organized the women to coordinate communication between search groups. Bill Henderson, despite being 72 years old, insisted on joining one of the teams that would comb the woods around Miller's Lake. Even Dr. Franklin, who usually kept to himself except for medical emergencies, volunteered to help. Hayes divided the volunteers into groups of 4 or 5, each led by someone familiar with the local terrain. The first group searched the obvious places, the spots where teenagers typically gathered during summer vacation. The old swimming hole upstream from the main lake, the abandoned barn on the Whitmore property, the network of hiking trails that crisscrossed the forest behind town. The second group focused on the roads Danny might have taken, driving slowly and stopping to examine anywhere a bicycle might have gone off the pavement. They checked ditches, looked behind tree lines, investigated every possible spot where an accident might have occurred without witnesses. A third group organized a more systematic search of Miller's Lake itself. Several men brought their fishing boats, rowing close to shore and peering into the clear water for any sign of the boy or his bicycle. The lake wasn't particularly deep near the edges, and visibility was good enough that they felt confident they could spot anything unusual. As the day wore on without any trace of Danny Morrison, the searchers began to feel the weight of genuine concern. In 1965, missing children were something that happened to other people, in other places. Millbrook was supposed to be immune to such tragedies. "The thing that's got me puzzled," Chief Hayes confided to Frank Morrison during a break in the searching, "is that bicycle of his. That Schwinn Stingray of Danny's stands out like a sore thumb, bright blue, all those chrome extras he put on it. If that bike is anywhere around here, someone should have spotted it by now." Frank nodded, clinging to the hope that Hayes was offering. Maybe he rode further than usual. You know how kids are when they get excited about something. Maybe he met some other boys, went exploring somewhere new. But even as he said it, Frank knew it didn't ring true. Danny was responsible about time, especially when it came to family dinners, and all his friends had been accounted for, all waiting for him at Miller's Lake, all eventually going home when he never appeared. The search continued for 3 days, expanding outward from Millbrook in ever-widening circles. State police were notified, though they offered little help beyond taking an official report. Missing person cases involving teenagers were typically handled locally, with the assumption that most kids turned up within 48 hours with embarrassed explanations about losing track of time. But Danny Morrison didn't turn up. Not in 48 hours, not in a week, not in the months that followed. His Schwinn Stingray bicycle, the pride and joy that he'd worked so hard to buy and had spent so many hours customizing, had vanished just as completely as the boy who rode it. The absence of the bicycle became both a source of hope and growing dread. Hope, because it suggested Danny had ridden somewhere under his own power, that he wasn't lying injured in the woods around Millbrook. Dread, because as the days passed without any sighting of that distinctive blue frame and chrome accessories, it became increasingly clear that whatever had happened to Danny Morrison had happened somewhere far from home. As the first week passed without any trace of Danny Morrison, the people of Millbrook began grasping for explanations that might make sense of the impossible. In coffee shops and grocery store aisles, at church gatherings and backyard barbecues, theories spread like ripples across Miller's Lake on a calm day. The most common suggestion, whispered with the kind of false confidence that people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as others, was that Danny had simply run away. Teenagers did that sometimes, didn't they? Got overwhelmed by expectations, by the pressure of growing up in a small town where everyone watched everything you did. Maybe he'd taken his bicycle and headed for the big city, looking for adventure and freedom. But anyone who really knew Danny Morrison dismissed this theory almost immediately. The boy had never shown the slightest interest in leaving Millbrook, let alone abandoning his family without a word. He talked constantly about his future plans, all of which involved staying close to home, maybe going to the state college an hour away, taking over his father's hardware store someday. Danny wasn't running from anything. He was running toward a life he was excited to build. Helen Morrison became visibly upset whenever someone suggested her son had run away. "Danny wouldn't do that to us," she would say, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "He knows how much we love him. He knows we'd be worried sick." Other theories emerged as the days passed, each more troubling than the last. Some people began to whisper about foul play, though the idea seemed almost obscene in a place like Millbrook. Bad things like that happened in cities, in places where people didn't know their neighbors, where strangers could come and go without being noticed. Chief Hayes found himself caught between his instincts as a lawman and his love for the community he'd sworn to protect. Part of him knew that statistically, when a child disappeared without a trace, the explanation was rarely innocent, But another part of him couldn't accept that such darkness could touch their peaceful town. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield was 78 years old and lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, where Elm Street dead-ended at the old logging road. She was known for spending her afternoons on her front porch, watching the world go by with the sharp attention of someone who had outlived most of her contemporaries and found entertainment in observing the patterns of daily life. It took almost a week for anyone to think to ask Mrs. Whitfield if she'd seen anything unusual on the day Danny disappeared. When Chief Hayes finally knocked on her door, she invited him in for tea and cookies as if she'd been expecting his visit all along. "Of course I saw the Morrison boy," she said, settling into her favorite armchair with the practiced movements of someone whose joints protested every shift in position. "Saw him riding that fancy bicycle of his right past my house. Must have been around 2:15 in the afternoon." Hayes felt his pulse quicken. This was the first concrete sighting of Danny after he'd left home that morning. Which direction was he heading, Mrs. Whitfield? "Toward the old logging road. Same as always when those children go exploring. Though I'll tell you what struck me as odd." She paused to sip her tea, organizing her thoughts with the deliberate care of someone who understood the importance of getting details right. He wasn't in any hurry. Usually when those boys ride past here, they're racing each other or showing off, making all kinds of noise. But Danny was just riding normal-like. Not fast, not slow, like he was thinking about something. The old logging road hadn't been used for timber operations in over 20 years. It wound through dense forest for about 3 miles before branching off in several directions, some paths leading to abandoned work sites, others connecting to hiking trails that eventually reached the far side of Miller's Lake. It was exactly the kind of place that would appeal to adventurous teenagers looking for somewhere new to explore. Hayes organized another search party. This one focused specifically on the logging road and its various branches. They found tire tracks in the soft dirt, but the dry weather of late July had baked the ground hard in many places, making it impossible to determine which tracks were recent and which might have been left weeks or months earlier. More frustrating still, the tracks seemed to simply vanish where the dirt road met rocky ground or thick grass. It was as if Danny Morrison and his blue Schwinn Stingray had simply evaporated into the summer air. Mrs. Whitfield's sighting became the last confirmed glimpse anyone had of Danny Morrison. 2:15 in the afternoon on July 23, 1965, riding his bicycle toward the old logging road with the unhurried pace of a boy who had all the time in the world. After that, there was nothing but theories, speculation, and the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to Millbrook's golden boy. The town that had always felt so safe, so protected from the darkness that plagued other places, began to realize that evil could find its way anywhere, even to a quiet street where an elderly woman sat on her porch watching the world go by. The old logging road stretched away from Millbrook like a finger pointing into the heart of the surrounding wilderness. What had once been a busy thoroughfare for timber trucks in the 1940s and early 50s now served mainly as a pathway for teenagers seeking adventure and families looking for secluded picnic spots. The road itself was nothing more than packed dirt and gravel, rutted from years of disuse and spring rain runoff that carved deeper channels with each passing season. Chief Hayes stood at the spot where Mrs. Whitfield had last seen Danny Morrison, trying to imagine what might have drawn the boy down this particular path. The road began innocently enough, wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, bordered on both sides by towering pine trees that created a natural tunnel of green shade even in the brightest summer sunlight. The first destination along the logging road was the abandoned Whitmore Mill, about 1.5 miles from where the road branched off from Elm Street. The mill had been closed since 1957 when the Whitmore family sold their lumber business to a larger company that moved operations closer to the interstate highway. What remained was a collection of weathered buildings, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, their windows broken by thrown stones and their walls covered with the kind of graffiti that teenagers had been carving into wood since the beginning of time. Search teams combed through every building at the mill site, looking for any sign that Danny might have stopped there. The main mill building was dark and echoing, filled with rusted machinery that looked like sleeping giants in the dim light filtering through broken windows. Smaller outbuildings that had once housed offices and equipment storage were equally empty, though they found evidence that other young people had used the buildings as hangouts over the years. Empty beer bottles, cigarette butts, and crude initials carved into wooden beams told the story of teenagers who had discovered this hidden place and claimed it as their own. But there was no sign of Danny Morrison or his distinctive blue bicycle anywhere at the mill site. Beyond the Whitmore Mill, the logging road split into several smaller paths. One branch led deeper into the forest, eventually connecting to a network of hiking trails that the State Forestry Service maintained for outdoor enthusiasts. These trails wound through miles of wilderness, crossing streams and climbing ridges that offered spectacular views of the surrounding countryside. Another branch of the road curved back toward Miller's Lake, approaching the water from the opposite side of town. This route was popular with fishermen who preferred the quieter, less accessible spots along the shoreline where the big bass were said to hide in the shadows of fallen trees and rocky overhangs. The search teams found their first real clue about 2 miles down the main logging road, at a spot where recent rains had left a patch of soft, muddy ground. Pressed into the earth were tire tracks that looked like they could have come from a bicycle, the distinctive tread pattern of relatively new tires cutting clean lines in the damp soil. Bill Henderson, who had volunteered for the search despite his advanced age, was the one who spotted the tracks. "Look here," he called to the other searchers, his voice carrying the excitement of a man who had found the first piece of a difficult puzzle. "These look fresh to me, and see how narrow they are? That's bicycle tires, not car tires." Chief Hayes knelt beside the tracks, studying them with the careful attention of someone who knew that details might be crucial later. The tread pattern was clear and sharp, suggesting the tracks had been made recently, possibly within the past week. The spacing between the two tire marks matched what you'd expect from a standard bicycle, and the depth of the impression suggested someone of Danny's approximate weight. But frustration set in quickly when the search teams tried to follow the trail further. Where the logging road climbed onto higher, rockier ground, the tire tracks simply vanished. The hard-packed earth and exposed stone showed no clear impressions, and despite hours of careful searching, no one could pick up the trail on the far side of the rocky stretch. It was as if Danny Morrison had ridden his bicycle to that specific spot and then somehow lifted off into the air, bicycle and all, leaving no trace of where he might have gone next. The discovery of the tire tracks should have been encouraging, proof that they were on the right path, evidence that Danny had indeed come this way. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. The tracks confirmed that Danny had ridden at least 2 miles down the old logging road, but they provided no clue about his ultimate destination or what might have happened to him after he reached the rocky ground where his trail disappeared. Search teams spent another full day exploring every possible route Danny might have taken from that point. They followed hiking trails deep into the wilderness, checked every fishing spot along the remote sections of Miller's Lake shoreline, and investigated abandoned cabins and hunting camps that dotted the forest. They found nothing. The old logging road had swallowed Danny Morrison and his blue Schwinn Stingray as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only a few tire tracks in the mud and more questions than anyone knew how to answer. The first week after Danny's disappearance had brought the Morrison family together in their shared fear and hope. But as days stretched into weeks without any word, without any trace, without any answers, the very foundation of their lives began to crack and crumble, like a house built on shifting sand. Frank Morrison was the first to break. By the end of July, he had stopped opening Morrison hardware altogether, leaving a hastily written sign on the front door that read, "Closed, due to family emergency." The store that had been his pride and joy, the business that had supported his family for 15 years, suddenly meant nothing compared to the consuming need to find his missing son. Every morning before dawn, Frank would climb into his Ford pickup truck and drive the roads around Millbrook, following routes that had become as familiar as the lines on his own hands. He would park at different spots along the old logging road, walking the same paths the search teams had already covered dozens of times, calling Danny's name until his voice grew hoarse and the sun began to set. His wife tried to reason with him at first. "Frank, honey, the police have searched those areas. The volunteers have been over every inch of that forest. You need to come home. You need to eat something. You need to rest." But Frank Morrison couldn't rest. He couldn't eat. He couldn't think about anything except the possibility that his son was out there somewhere, maybe hurt, maybe trapped, maybe calling for help that would never come. The rational part of his mind knew that after 3 weeks the chances of finding Danny alive were slim to none. But the part of him that was a father, the part that remembered teaching a 5-year-old boy to ride his first bicycle, refused to accept that possibility. Helen Morrison responded to her son's disappearance in the opposite way. Where her husband became manic with activity, she retreated deeper and deeper into herself, as if she could somehow make the pain stop by simply shutting down entirely. She would sit for hours in Danny's bedroom, holding his clothes and staring out the window at the empty driveway where his blue Schwinn Stingray should have been parked. The woman who had once been the backbone of her family, who had managed the household with gentle efficiency while working full-time at the library, now struggled to perform the most basic tasks. Meals went uncooked, laundry piled up in corners, and the beautiful garden she had tended with such care began to wither from neglect. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles and offers of help, but Helen would barely acknowledge their presence. She would nod politely and mumble thank you, but her eyes remained distant, unfocused, as if she was looking at something the rest of the world couldn't see. 12-year-old Susan Morrison found herself caught in the middle of her parents' contrasting forms of grief, and in many ways, she suffered the most. At an age when she needed guidance and reassurance, when she needed her parents to help her make sense of an incomprehensible tragedy, she instead found herself essentially orphaned by their inability to cope with their loss. Susan tried to fill the growing void in her household. She attempted to cook simple meals, though her culinary skills were limited to scrambled eggs and peanut butter sandwiches. She did her own laundry and tried to keep her room clean, somehow believing that if she could just maintain some sense of normalcy, her parents might notice and remember that they still had one child who needed them. But Frank was always gone, driving the back roads and searching the same empty places over and over again. And Helen was present in body but absent in every way that mattered, staring through Susan as if she had become invisible. The community's initial outpouring of support began to fade as August wore on without any developments in the case. People had their own lives to live, their own families to care for, their own problems to solve. The steady stream of visitors to the Morrison house slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Chief Hayes still checked in regularly, but even his visits became shorter and less frequent as other demands pulled at his attention. The reality was that the investigation had hit a wall, and without new evidence or witnesses, there was nowhere else to look. By September, as the new school year began, and life in Millbrook returned to something resembling normal routine, the Morrison family had become ghosts of their former selves. Frank's hardware store remained closed, its windows dusty and dark. Helen had taken indefinite leave from her job at the library, claiming illness that everyone understood but no one spoke about directly. And Susan Morrison walked to school each morning past the empty driveway where her brother's bicycle should have been, past the garden where her mother's flowers had turned brown and died, through a house that had once been filled with laughter and conversation but now echoed with nothing but the sound of her own footsteps. The disappearance of Danny Morrison had claimed more than just one 16-year-old boy. It had swallowed an entire family, leaving behind only hollow shells of the people they used to be. By September of 1965, Chief Robert Hayes found himself staring at the thinnest case file he'd ever seen for something so important. The manila folder labeled Morrison, Daniel Missing Person, contained exactly 7 pages of documentation, and most of those were reports of places that had been searched without success. There was Mrs. Whitfield's witness statement, carefully typed on the police department's old Royal typewriter, describing her sighting of Danny riding toward the old logging road at approximately 2:15 on the afternoon of July 23rd. There was a sketch map showing the tire tracks found in the mud 2 miles down that same road, along with measurements and photographs that somehow managed to make the discovery look less significant than it had felt at the time. The rest of the file consisted of a growing list of locations where Danny Morrison was not. The abandoned Whitmore Mill, searched 3 times. Miller's Lake, dragged by volunteers until they knew every submerged log and rock formation. The network of hiking trails that spread through the surrounding forest like veins through a leaf, each one walked by search teams until the paths were worn deeper from their passage than from years of normal use. Chief Hayes had swallowed his pride in early August and requested assistance from the state police. Detective Lieutenant Paul Morrison, no relation to the missing boy despite sharing his surname, arrived from Albany with the kind of professional competence that made small-town police officers feel both grateful and inadequate. Lieutenant Morrison spent 3 days reviewing the case, re-interviewing witnesses, and examining the physical evidence with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had handled dozens of similar investigations. His conclusion was as disappointing as it was professional. "You've done everything right, Chief," he said, sitting in Hayes's cramped office while rain drummed against the single window that looked out on Millbrook's quiet main street. "Sometimes there just isn't enough to work with. The boy vanished, and he didn't leave enough of a trail for us to follow." The state investigator's report, when it arrived 2 weeks later, was equally frustrating in its brevity. It acknowledged that Danny Morrison had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, noted the thoroughness of the local search efforts, and concluded that without additional evidence or witnesses, the case would have to be classified as inactive pending new developments. "Inactive," Chief Hayes said the word aloud to his empty office, tasting its bitter finality. Not closed, because that would suggest they had found answers. Not solved, because Danny Morrison was still missing. Just inactive, a bureaucratic term that meant they had run out of things to do and places to look. The case file went into the filing cabinet behind Hayes's desk, squeezed between folders for petty theft cases and traffic violations that seemed impossibly trivial by comparison. But Hayes couldn't bring himself to push it all the way back into the drawer. Instead, he left it near the front, easily accessible, as if keeping it within reach might somehow generate the breakthrough they all hoped for. Frank Morrison continued his daily drives down the old logging road, even as the leaves began to change color and the first hints of autumn crept into the air. Chief Hayes would sometimes encounter him during his own patrols, the man's Ford pickup truck parked at random spots along the forest roads, while Frank walked through the trees calling his son's name. "Find anything today?" Hayes would ask, though they both knew the answer. "Not yet," Frank would reply, his voice carrying a determination that sounded increasingly hollow as the weeks passed. "But I'm not giving up." Helen Morrison had stopped asking about the investigation entirely. When Chief Hayes visited their house to check on the family, she would listen politely to his reports about new search areas or follow-up interviews, but her eyes remained distant, unfocused, as if the details of the investigation belonged to someone else's tragedy. The town of Millbrook gradually returned to its normal rhythms as summer gave way to fall. Children walked to school along the same streets where Danny Morrison had ridden his bicycle, but their parents watched them more carefully now, called them inside earlier in the evening, asked more questions about where they were going and who they would be with. The innocence that had once defined their community had been cracked, not shattered completely but damaged in a way that would never fully heal. Everyone in Millbrook now knew that terrible things could happen anywhere, even in places that felt safe, even to families that seemed blessed with happiness and love. Danny Morrison's name appeared in the regional newspaper on the 2-month anniversary of his disappearance, a brief article that rehashed the basic facts and asked anyone with information to contact the Millbrook Police Department. The phone didn't ring. By October, even the most optimistic residents of Millbrook had begun to accept what Chief Hayes had known for weeks. Danny Morrison wasn't coming home. Whatever had happened to him on that sunny July afternoon had taken him somewhere beyond the reach of search parties and police investigations, somewhere that might never yield its secrets. The case remained officially open, but practically speaking, it had joined the ranks of unsolved mysteries that haunted small communities across America. Another missing child, another family destroyed, another reminder that some questions have no answers and some stories have no endings. The Morrison family never recovered from the summer of 1965. Like a building damaged by an earthquake, they might have looked intact from the outside, but the structural damage ran too deep for any hope of true repair. Frank Morrison held on longer than anyone expected. Through the fall and winter following Danny's disappearance, he continued his daily searches, driving the same roads and walking the same forest paths with the determination of a man who believed that persistence alone could bring his son home. But as 1966 arrived without any new leads or discoveries, something fundamental broke inside him. The hardware store that had been his life's work became unbearable. Every customer who walked through the door reminded him of conversations about Danny, well-meaning questions about the investigation, or worse, the careful way people avoided mentioning his missing son at all. The bicycle repair section was particularly painful, a corner of the store where he had helped Danny maintain his beloved Schwinn Stingray, teaching him about tire pressure and chain lubrication, and the simple satisfaction of keeping mechanical things running smoothly. By the spring of 1967, Frank Morrison couldn't stand it anymore. He sold Morrison hardware to a chain store from Albany, accepting far less money than the business was worth, because he needed to escape more than he needed to negotiate. The new owners kept the Morrison name on the storefront for exactly 6 months before replacing it with corporate signage that looked like every other hardware store in every other small town across America. The family moved to Albany in June of 1967, almost exactly 2 years after Danny's disappearance. Frank found work as a manager at a large hardware supplier, a job that paid well enough but lacked the personal satisfaction of running his own business. Helen Morrison transferred to a branch library in their new neighborhood, grateful for work that didn't remind her constantly of the son who would never again come looking for books about bicycles or adventure stories. But changing their address couldn't change what had happened to their family. Helen's depression, which had begun as a natural response to devastating loss, deepened into something clinical and persistent. She would go through the motions of daily life, showing up for work and maintaining their household. But the spark that had once made her laugh easily and find joy in simple pleasures had been extinguished completely. Susan Morrison, now 14 and trying to navigate high school in a new city where nobody knew about her missing brother, found herself trapped between relief and guilt. Part of her was grateful to escape the suffocating atmosphere of Millbrook, where everyone knew her as the sister of the boy who had vanished. But another part of her felt like they were abandoning Danny, leaving him behind in that forest where his bicycle tracks had disappeared into nothing. She developed the habit of introducing herself as an only child when meeting new people, a lie that felt both necessary and terrible. It was easier than explaining about Danny, easier than seeing the mixture of pity and curiosity that appeared in people's eyes when they learned her family's story. But each time she denied her brother's existence, Susan felt like she was killing him a little more. The nightmares followed her to Albany. Dreams where she would see Danny riding his blue Schwinn Stingray just ahead of her, always turning a corner or disappearing over a hill before she could catch up. Dreams where she would call his name and he would turn around, but his face would be blank, empty, as if he had forgotten who she was or why she was looking for him. Back in Millbrook, Danny Morrison's disappearance became part of the town's history, a tragic story that new residents would hear about from their neighbors and longtime locals would reference when they wanted to make a point about how much safer things used to be. Every July 23rd, the Millbrook Gazette would run a small article marking another anniversary of the unsolved case, always ending with a request for anyone with information to contact the police. Chief Hayes kept the case file active until his retirement in 1973, pulling it out periodically to review the sparse evidence and wonder if there was something he had missed, some lead he had failed to pursue thoroughly enough. His replacement, a younger man from the state police, reviewed the file once and then filed it away with the other cold cases that seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The old logging road where Danny was last seen gradually reclaimed itself. Without regular maintenance, small trees began growing through cracks in the packed dirt, and seasonal flooding carved new channels that made vehicle access increasingly difficult. The abandoned Whitmore Mill, already deteriorating when Danny disappeared, collapsed entirely during a severe storm in 1971. Susan Morrison graduated from high school in Albany in 1971, 6 years after her brother's disappearance. She went on to college, earned a degree in education, and eventually became a teacher herself. She married a kind man who knew about Danny and understood why she sometimes became distant around the anniversary dates, why she couldn't bring herself to have children of her own. Frank Morrison died of a heart attack in 1984, 19 years after losing his son. Helen Morrison lived until 1997, spending her final years in a nursing home where she would sometimes ask the staff if anyone had heard from Danny lately. The disease that took her memory was cruel in some ways but merciful in others, allowing her to forget, at least temporarily, the summer that had destroyed her family. Through all those years, through all the moves and job changes, and attempts to build new lives, the question remained: what had happened to Danny Morrison on that sunny July afternoon in 1965? The question followed the surviving family members like a shadow, always present even when they tried not to think about it, a wound that never quite healed because it never received the closure that only answers could provide. Susan Martinez stood in the parking lot of Miller's Lake on a crisp October morning in the year 2000, watching her 2 teenagers skip stones across the same water where her brother had planned to swim 35 years earlier. The lake looked exactly as she remembered it from her childhood, crystal clear and surrounded by pine trees that had grown taller but remained essentially unchanged by the decades that had passed. At 47 years old, Susan had finally found the courage to return to Millbrook. Her parents were both gone now, Frank having died of a sudden heart attack in 1987, Helen following him 10 years later after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. Neither had lived to see any resolution to the mystery that had destroyed their family, and Susan carried the weight of being the only person left who remembered Danny Morrison as a living, breathing boy rather than just a tragic story. Her children, Michael and Sarah, knew about their missing uncle, but the story had always felt distant to them, like something that had happened to someone else's family in someone else's lifetime. Now, standing in the place where their uncle had planned to meet his friends on the last day anyone ever saw him, the reality of the family tragedy began to take on new meaning for them. "This is where Uncle Danny was supposed to meet his friends?" 16-year-old Michael asked, his voice carrying the careful tone teenagers use when they're trying to show respect for adult grief they don't fully understand. "Right here," Susan replied, pointing to a rocky outcropping that jutted into the lake about 50 yards from where they stood. He and Tommy Chen and Sarah Williams, they always met at that spot, had their own little diving area where they could show off for each other. 14-year-old Sarah Martinez, named for her grandmother but also carrying an inadvertent connection to one of Danny's friends, picked up a smooth stone and sent it skipping across the water's surface. "What do you think happened to him, Mom?" It was a question Susan had been asking herself for 35 years, and she still didn't have an answer that satisfied her. "I don't know, sweetheart. I wish I did." The town of Millbrook had changed considerably since Susan's childhood. The main street that she remembered as a collection of family-owned businesses now housed a mixture of chain stores and empty storefronts, victims of the economic changes that had swept through small-town America in the decades since she'd moved away. The movie theater where she and her friends had watched Saturday matinees was now an insurance office. Peterson's drugstore, where Danny had bought comic books and candy, had been replaced by a convenience store that sold lottery tickets and overpriced groceries. But some things remained the same. The elementary school where her mother had worked as a librarian still stood on Maple Street, though it had been expanded and modernized beyond recognition. The Presbyterian church, where the Morrison family had attended services every Sunday, still held its white steeple high above the surrounding buildings, though the congregation was smaller now, and the pastor was someone Susan had never met. Most significantly, the house on Elm Street where Susan had grown up still stood, though it was painted a different color and the wraparound porch her mother had loved had been enclosed to create additional living space. Susan drove slowly past the house, her children peering out the car windows with curiosity, trying to imagine their mother as a 12-year-old girl waiting for her older brother to come home from his bicycle adventures. The current owners had no idea about the tragedy that had once unfolded in their home, and Susan didn't feel compelled to enlighten them. Some stories were better left buried, some pain better left undisturbed. The old logging road where Danny had last been seen was harder to find than Susan remembered. Urban development had changed the landscape considerably, with new housing developments extending the town's boundaries further into what had once been wilderness. But eventually, with the help of a local gas station attendant who had grown up in Millbrook, she found the dirt road that still wound its way into the forest. The road itself was in even worse condition than it had been in 1965, rutted and overgrown to the point where Susan's sedan could only travel a few hundred yards before the way became impassable. She and her children walked the rest of the distance, following the path that Danny had taken on his bicycle 35 years earlier. The abandoned Whitmore Mill was completely gone, reclaimed by the forest until only a few concrete foundations remained to mark where the buildings had once stood. Susan stood in the clearing where the mill had been, trying to reconcile her memories of the search parties that had combed through every building with the peaceful grove of young trees that now occupied the space. "It's like he just vanished into thin air," Michael observed, unknowingly echoing the same words that Chief Hayes had used all those years ago. "That's exactly what it was like," Susan replied. "One minute he was there, the next minute he was gone, and nobody ever figured out where he went." The visit to Millbrook was supposed to provide closure, a way for Susan to make peace with her family's tragedy and help her children understand the history that had shaped their mother's life. Instead, it only reinforced the mystery and the pain that had never really faded, even after 35 years. July 23, 2005 marked exactly 40 years since Danny Morrison had vanished from the streets of Millbrook, and the anniversary weighed heavily on the small community that had never forgotten its missing son. The case had become part of local folklore, a story passed down from parents to children, a reminder that even in the safest places, terrible things could happen without warning or explanation. Mike Chen had grown up hearing about Danny Morrison from his father, Tommy Chen, who had been one of Danny's closest friends, and had spent that long-ago afternoon waiting at Miller's Lake for a boy who never came. Now, 38 years old and a certified diving instructor, Mike had established the Millbrook Community Diving Club 3 years earlier, teaching local teenagers and adults the skills needed to explore the underwater world of Miller's Lake safely. The lake had always fascinated Mike, partly because of its connection to his family's history, and partly because of its surprising depth and complexity. What appeared to be a simple mountain lake from the surface was actually a complicated underwater landscape of ledges, drop-offs, and hidden caverns that had been carved out by glacial activity thousands of years earlier. When Susan Martinez contacted Mike in the spring of 2005, asking if his diving club might be willing to search Miller's Lake one more time, he felt the weight of family obligation and community responsibility settling on his shoulders. His father had never stopped wondering what had happened to his friend, and Mike had grown up with that same unanswered question echoing through his childhood. "The technology we have now is so much better than anything they had in 1965, Mike explained to Susan during their first meeting at the same coffee shop where her parents had once planned search strategies. Back then they were dragging the lake with hooks and chains looking for something they could snag and pull up. We can actually see what's down there now. The diving equipment available in 2005 represented a quantum leap beyond what had existed 4 decades earlier. Mike and his club members used modern regulators and buoyancy control devices that allowed for precise underwater navigation. They carried waterproof flashlights powerful enough to illuminate the darkest depths of the lake, and they wore dry suits that could protect them during extended searches in water that remained cold even during the warmest summer months. Most importantly, they had underwater metal detectors, sophisticated devices that could identify metallic objects buried in silt or wedged into crevices where visual searches might miss them entirely. The original search teams in 1965 had been limited to what they could see from the surface or reach with primitive dragging equipment. The systematic search of Miller's Lake began on the 40th anniversary of Danny's disappearance, July 23, 2005. Mike had recruited 8 experienced divers from his club, all of whom understood the historical significance of their mission and the importance of conducting a thorough, methodical exploration. They divided Miller's Lake into a grid pattern, marking each section with bright orange buoys that could be seen from the surface. The plan was to search one grid square at a time, with teams of 2 divers working together to ensure both safety and thoroughness. Each dive would last approximately 45 minutes, the maximum time their air supplies would allow at the depths they expected to reach. Susan Martinez stood on the shore watching the first team of divers disappear beneath the surface, carrying with them 40 years of hope and heartbreak. Her own children, now in college, had driven up from Albany to witness the search, understanding that this might be their family's last chance to find answers about their uncle's fate. The first day of searching covered the shallow areas near shore, the spots where the original search teams in 1965 had focused most of their attention. Mike and his partner found the usual collection of lost fishing lures, discarded beer cans, and the occasional lost anchor, but nothing that related to Danny Morrison or his bicycle. The second day took them into deeper water, 40 to 60 feet below the surface, where the underwater landscape became more dramatic and complex. Here, the lake bottom was littered with fallen trees and rocky outcroppings that created a maze of hiding places where something could remain concealed for decades. It was on the third day of searching that everything changed. Mike Chen and his diving partner Jennifer Walsh were working a grid square in the deepest part of Miller's Lake, nearly 70 feet below the surface, when Jennifer's metal detector began signaling the presence of something metallic wedged beneath a rocky ledge. At first, they assumed it would be another piece of discarded fishing equipment, or perhaps part of an old boat motor that had been lost years earlier. Miller's Lake had been a popular recreation destination for generations, and its bottom was scattered with the detritus of decades of human activity. But as they worked to clear away the silt and debris that had accumulated around the metallic object, Mike Chen realized they had found something much more significant than lost fishing gear. Partially buried beneath the rocky overhang, covered by 40 years of sediment and algae growth, was the unmistakable frame of a bicycle. Miller's Lake had always been considered a relatively shallow body of water by the residents of Millbrook, with most people assuming it reached depths of maybe 20 or 30 feet at its deepest points. The original search teams in 1965 had operated under this assumption, focusing their dragging efforts in areas where they believed they could reach the bottom with their primitive equipment. But Mike Chen and his diving team quickly discovered that Miller's Lake held secrets that no one had suspected. Their depth gauges revealed sections of the lake that plunged to over 80 feet, far deeper than anyone had imagined possible. More surprising still was the complex underwater topography they encountered, a landscape of rocky ledges, hidden caverns, and dramatic drop-offs that created countless places where something could remain concealed for decades. The lake's underwater geography told the story of its formation during the last ice age, when massive glaciers had carved deep channels and scraped out hidden pockets in the bedrock. What appeared from the surface to be a simple mountain lake was actually a complicated maze of underwater cliffs, crevices, and sheltered alcoves that had never been properly mapped or explored. On their third day of systematic searching, Jennifer Walsh and her diving partner Tom Bradley were working the deepest section of their assigned grid, nearly 45 feet below the surface, in water so dark that their powerful diving lights created narrow cones of visibility in the surrounding blackness. The bottom here was covered with decades of accumulated sediment, fallen leaves, and organic matter that had drifted down from the surface and settled into a soft, muddy layer several inches deep. Jennifer's underwater metal detector had been giving intermittent signals all morning, mostly false alarms caused by discarded fishing sinkers or lost pieces of boat hardware. But as they approached a particularly dramatic underwater ledge, the device began emitting a steady, strong signal that indicated something substantial buried beneath the rocky overhang. Working carefully in the limited visibility and confined space beneath the ledge, Jennifer began clearing away the accumulated silt and debris that covered whatever metallic object was triggering her detector. The work was slow and methodical, made more challenging by the need to maintain neutral buoyancy while manipulating tools in the cramped space under the rocky shelf. As she cleared away more sediment, the outline of something large and metallic began to emerge from the lake bottom. At first, Jennifer thought it might be part of an old outboard motor, or perhaps a large fishing tackle box that had been lost during some long-ago fishing expedition. But as more of the object became visible, she realized she was looking at something far more significant. The distinctive curved frame of a bicycle began to take shape in the beam of her diving light. 40 years of submersion had taken their toll on the metal, covering it with layers of corrosion and algae growth that made identification difficult. But the basic structure was unmistakable, the familiar diamond shape of a bicycle frame emerging from decades of concealment beneath Miller's Lake. Jennifer's heart began racing as she realized the potential significance of her discovery. She tapped her dive knife against her air tank, creating the sharp metallic sound that divers use to attract their partner's attention underwater. Tom Bradley swam over immediately, his own powerful light joining Jennifer's to illuminate their find more clearly. Together, they worked to expose more of the bicycle, carefully brushing away sediment and plant growth, to reveal details that might help identify the machine they had found. The work required patience and delicacy, as 40 years of corrosion had made the metal fragile and prone to breaking apart if handled too roughly. What emerged from their careful excavation was heartbreaking in its implications. The bicycle frame showed evidence of significant impact damage, with bends and breaks that suggested it had been subjected to considerable force before coming to rest in its underwater hiding place. More disturbing still, heavy chains were wrapped around the frame, clearly intended to weigh the bicycle down and ensure it would sink to the deepest part of the lake. Jennifer and Tom completed their dive without attempting to raise the bicycle, understanding that this discovery required careful handling and proper documentation. As they surfaced and swam toward shore, both divers carried the weight of knowing that they had likely found the key to a 40-year-old mystery that had haunted their community since before they were born. Mike Chen was waiting on the shore when his two team members emerged from the water, their faces showing the excitement and gravity of people who had just made a significant discovery. The other searchers gathered around as Jennifer and Tom described what they had found beneath the rocky ledge in the deepest part of Miller's Lake. Susan Martinez stood among the group of listeners, her face pale as she processed the implications of what the divers were describing. After 40 years of questions and sleepless nights, after 4 decades of wondering what had happened to her brother, the first piece of the puzzle had finally surfaced from the dark waters where it had been hidden since the summer of 1965. The recovery of the bicycle from Miller's Lake took most of the following day, with Mike Chen's diving team working carefully to preserve any evidence that might remain after 40 years underwater. They used lifting bags and specialized equipment to raise the corroded frame slowly and gently, understanding that this piece of metal might be the key to solving Millbrook's most enduring mystery. When the bicycle finally broke the surface of Miller's Lake, everyone gathered on the shore could see that despite 4 decades of submersion and the heavy layer of algae and corrosion that covered every surface, this was unmistakably a Schwinn Stingray from the mid-1960s. The distinctive frame design, the characteristic proportions, and most telling of all, traces of metallic blue paint visible beneath the accumulated debris, all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Susan Martinez took one look at the waterlogged bicycle and felt her knees go weak. Even in its deteriorated condition, she recognized the custom modifications that had made Danny's bike unique among all the Schwinn Stingrays in Millbrook. The special reflectors he'd installed on the spokes, the upgraded brake levers he'd saved for months to afford, the distinctive white wall tires that had been his pride and joy. "That's Danny's bike," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the lapping of small waves against the shore. "That's definitely his bike." Word of the discovery spread through Millbrook with the same lightning speed that had characterized the original search 40 years earlier. By evening, the entire town knew that Danny Morrison's bicycle had been found at the bottom of Miller's Lake, and the implications of that discovery were keeping everyone awake long into the night. The current police chief, Sarah Rodriguez, who had taken over the department 5 years earlier, found herself dealing with the biggest case of her career. She had read the Morrison file when she first arrived in Millbrook, studying the sparse documentation of the 1965 investigation as part of her effort to familiarize herself with the town's history. Now, she was faced with new evidence in a case that everyone had assumed would never be solved. Chief Rodriguez arranged for the bicycle to be transported to the state crime lab in Albany, where forensic specialists could examine it properly and attempt to extract any evidence that might have survived its long submersion. But even before the scientific analysis began, the location where the bike was found told a disturbing story that raised more questions than it answered. The rocky ledge where Jennifer Walsh had discovered the Schwinn Stingray was in the deepest part of Miller's Lake, nearly 45 feet below the surface, and more than 100 yards from the nearest shoreline. There was no conceivable way that a bicycle could have reached that location through any kind of accident or mishap. Mike Chen, whose knowledge of the lake's underwater topography was more extensive than anyone else's, confirmed what everyone was beginning to understand. "There's no way that bike got there by itself," he explained to Chief Rodriguez and the assembled investigators. "The bottom slopes gradually out to about 20 feet, but then there's a dramatic drop-off. To reach the ledge where we found it, something would have had to be deliberately placed there or thrown from directly overhead." The heavy chains wrapped around the bicycle frame provided additional evidence that Danny's Schwinn Stingray had been intentionally disposed of in the deepest part of the lake. Someone had wanted to make sure the bicycle would never be found, weighting it down and placing it in a location where conventional search methods would never reach. Susan Martinez spent that night in a Millbrook motel room, the same town where her family had once been whole and happy, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what the discovery meant. After 40 years of wondering, of hoping against hope that Danny might somehow still be alive somewhere, the recovery of his bicycle forced her to confront the reality she had always tried to avoid. If Danny's bike was at the bottom of Miller's Lake, deliberately hidden and weighted down with chains, then Danny himself was almost certainly dead. Had been dead, in fact, since that July afternoon in 1965 when he rode away from their house on Elm Street and never came home. The discovery that should have provided closure instead opened new wounds and raised new questions. Who had put Danny's bicycle in the lake? Why had they gone to such lengths to hide it? And most importantly, what had happened to Danny himself? The metallic blue Schwinn Stingray that had once represented freedom and adventure for a 16-year-old boy had become evidence in what was now clearly a murder investigation. 40 years after the crime had been committed, the State Crime Laboratory in Albany had processed thousands of pieces of evidence over the years, but few cases generated the kind of intense interest that surrounded Danny Morrison's recovered bicycle. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the chief forensic analyst, understood that she was examining evidence in a case that had haunted a small community for 4 decades, and she approached her work with the meticulous care that such responsibility demanded. The first challenge was simply cleaning the bicycle enough to conduct a proper examination. 40 years at the bottom of Miller's Lake had covered every surface with layers of algae, sediment, and mineral deposits that had to be carefully removed without destroying any potential evidence. The process took 3 days, with technicians using specialized brushes and gentle chemical solutions to strip away the accumulated debris while preserving the underlying metal and any traces that might remain from 1965. What emerged from beneath the lake's accumulated debris was a story written in bent metal and broken parts. The Schwinn Stingray's frame showed extensive impact damage that was clearly not the result of normal wear and tear or gradual deterioration from its underwater environment. The front fork was severely bent, the handlebars twisted at an unnatural angle, and the rear wheel rim was cracked in multiple places. Dr. Hoffman documented each piece of damage with photographs and detailed measurements, building a comprehensive picture of the forces that had acted upon the bicycle before it came to rest beneath the rocky ledge. The pattern of damage was consistent with the bike having been thrown or dropped from a considerable height, possibly from the rocky cliffs that surrounded the deeper sections of Miller's Lake. More disturbing than the impact damage was the evidence of deliberate disposal. Wrapped tightly around the bicycle's frame was a heavy steel chain, the kind used for towing vehicles or securing heavy equipment. The chain had been threaded through the spokes of both wheels and around the seat post, ensuring that the bicycle would sink quickly to the bottom of the lake and remain there indefinitely. The chain itself provided additional clues about whoever had disposed of the bicycle. It was industrial-grade steel, not the kind of hardware that most people would have readily available in their homes or garages. The links were uniformly sized and showed the kind of precision manufacturing that suggested professional use, possibly in construction or logging operations. Analysis of the chain's corrosion patterns revealed that it had been relatively new when it was used to weight down the bicycle. Unlike the Schwinn Stingray itself, which showed the kind of surface rust and deterioration expected from 40 years underwater, the chain displayed the deeper corrosion characteristic of metal that had been submerged for the full 4 decades since Danny's disappearance. Dr. Hoffman's team also conducted a thorough examination of the sediment and debris that had accumulated around the bicycle during its long submersion. Mixed in with the usual collection of lake-bottom material, they found traces of fabric fibers that appeared to be consistent with clothing from the 1960s. The fibers were too degraded for detailed analysis, but their presence suggested that other items had been disposed of in the same location. Perhaps most significantly, the forensic team found microscopic traces of human blood on several parts of the bicycle frame. The blood evidence was severely degraded after 4 decades underwater, making DNA analysis impossible with the technology available in 2005. But the presence of blood, combined with the impact, damage, and deliberate disposal, painted a clear picture of violence and cover-up. The examination also revealed details about the bicycle itself that confirmed its identity beyond any doubt. Serial numbers etched into the frame matched the records that Frank Morrison had kept when he purchased the bike for his son's birthday in 1965. More personally meaningful were the custom modifications that Susan Martinez remembered so clearly, the special reflectors and upgraded components that had made Danny's Schwinn Stingray unique among all the bicycles in Millbrook. Dr. Hoffman compiled her findings into a comprehensive report that would serve as evidence in what had now officially become a homicide investigation. The bicycle had not simply been lost or abandoned, It had been deliberately hidden after being damaged in what appeared to be a violent encounter. The forensic evidence told a story that everyone had feared, but no one had wanted to acknowledge. Danny Morrison had not run away from home, had not suffered an accidental fall or drowning, had not simply gotten lost in the wilderness surrounding Miller's Lake. He had been the victim of a deliberate act of violence, and someone had gone to considerable lengths to conceal their crime by disposing of the evidence in the deepest part of the lake. The recovery of the bicycle marked the end of 40 years of uncertainty and the beginning of a new phase in the search for answers. Danny Morrison's disappearance was no longer a missing person case. It was a murder investigation, and the evidence pulled from the bottom of Miller's Lake provided the first concrete clues about what had happened on that July afternoon when a 16-year-old boy rode his bicycle toward an appointment with death. Chief Sarah Rodriguez had been running the Millbrook Police Department for 5 years when the diving team pulled Danny Morrison's bicycle from the bottom of Miller's Lake, but she had never handled a homicide investigation. In fact, no one in the department's history had ever dealt with a murder case, which made the decision to reopen the Morrison file both necessary and daunting. The old case folder that Chief Hayes had kept near the front of his filing cabinet had grown thin over the decades, containing the same 7 pages of documentation that had frustrated investigators 40 years earlier. But Rodriguez understood that the recovery of the bicycle changed everything, transforming what had been a missing person case into something far more serious and complex. Her first call was to the state police, requesting assistance from their major crimes unit. Detective Lieutenant Michael Barnes arrived in Millbrook within hours, bringing with him 40 years of investigative experience and access to forensic techniques that hadn't existed in 1965. Barnes reviewed the original case file with the kind of professional thoroughness that small-town police departments rarely experienced. "Your Chief Hayes did good work with what he had," Barnes told Rodriguez as they spread the old documents across her desk. "But we've got tools now that can extract information from evidence that would have been useless 40 years ago." The first breakthrough came from re-examining Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield's witness statement with modern investigative techniques. In 1965, her account of seeing Danny Morrison riding toward the old logging road had been taken at face value, recorded as a simple observation, with no follow-up questions about details that might have seemed unimportant at the time. But Lieutenant Barnes understood that witness interviews conducted decades after an event often revealed information that had been overlooked or forgotten during the original investigation. He arranged to speak with Mrs. Whitfield's nephew, Robert Whitfield, who was now in his 70s but had vivid memories of his aunt's final years before she passed away in 1989. "Aunt Eleanor used to talk about that Morrison boy disappearing," Robert told Barnes during their interview at his home on the outskirts of Millbrook. "She always said there was something about that day that bothered her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on." Barnes pressed for details, understanding that seemingly insignificant observations from 1965 might take on new meaning in light of what they now knew about Danny's fate. Robert Whitfield searched his memory, trying to recall conversations with his aunt from decades earlier. "She mentioned seeing a car that day, I think. Something about a vehicle that didn't belong in the neighborhood. Aunt Eleanor knew every car in Millbrook, knew who drove what, and when they were supposed to be where. She said there was a car parked near the logging road that afternoon, a car she didn't recognize." This was information that had never made it into the original police report, either because Mrs. Whitfield hadn't thought to mention it during her initial interview, or because Chief Hayes hadn't recognized its potential significance. In 1965, an unfamiliar car in Millbrook would have been noteworthy, but not necessarily suspicious. Now, it represented a potential lead that had been overlooked for 4 decades. Barnes also applied modern investigative techniques to the physical evidence from the bicycle recovery. The chain that had been used to weigh down Danny's Schwinn Stingray was sent to a metallurgy lab for detailed analysis, where specialists could determine its manufacturer, approximate age, and possible source. The results revealed that the chain had been manufactured by Industrial Hardware Supply Company, a regional distributor that served construction and logging operations throughout upstate New York during the 1960s. The specific gauge and link pattern were consistent with chains used for heavy equipment and vehicle recovery, suggesting that whoever disposed of the bicycle had access to industrial-grade hardware. More significantly, the forensic team was able to lift partial fingerprints from the chain links, prints that had been preserved by the lake's cold water and protected from degradation by layers of sediment. The prints were fragmentary and incomplete, but they provided enough detail for comparison against existing databases. The tire tracks that had been found on the old logging road in 1965 were also re-examined using modern forensic techniques. Photography technology in the 2000s allowed for detailed analysis of the original photographs, revealing tread patterns and measurements that hadn't been visible to investigators 4 decades earlier. Digital enhancement of the tire track photographs showed distinctive wear patterns that suggested the bicycle had been ridden hard over rough terrain shortly before reaching the muddy spot where the tracks were preserved. The pattern was consistent with someone riding frantically, possibly trying to escape from danger or get help. Lieutenant Barnes compiled all of this new information into a comprehensive case file that transformed the Morrison investigation from a collection of dead ends into an active homicide case with multiple leads to pursue. The discovery of the bicycle had not only confirmed that Danny Morrison was dead, it had provided the first concrete clues about who might have killed him and how they had tried to cover up their crime. Chief Rodriguez looked at the expanded case file and felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. After 40 years of questions and uncertainty, the Morrison family and the community of Millbrook deserved answers. The forensic evidence from the lake had given them their first real chance to find those answers, and Rodriguez was determined not to let that opportunity slip away. The case that had haunted Millbrook since 1965 was finally moving forward, driven by modern investigative techniques and evidence that had been waiting at the bottom of Miller's Lake for 4 decades. The reopening of Danny Morrison's case in 2005 created an unexpected phenomenon in Millbrook. People who had remained silent for 40 years suddenly found themselves compelled to share memories they had buried, secrets they had carried, and observations they had dismissed as unimportant decades earlier. The official investigation had given them permission to speak about things they had never felt comfortable discussing before. Robert Whitfield's revelation about his aunt's suppressed memories was just the beginning. Within days of Lieutenant Barnes's interview with him, Robert called the police station with additional information that had been troubling him since their conversation. "I remembered something else Aunt Eleanor used to say about that day," he told Detective Barnes over the phone, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades of uncertainty. "She didn't just see a strange car near the logging road. She saw Danny talking to someone through the car window. She always said it bothered her that she didn't get a good look at who was driving." This was crucial information that had never been documented in the original investigation. Barnes immediately arranged another meeting with Robert, this time bringing Chief Rodriguez and a stenographer to ensure that every detail was properly recorded. Aunt Eleanor was already in her late 70s in 1965, Robert explained as they sat in his living room, surrounded by photographs and mementos from his family's long history in Millbrook. People sometimes dismissed what she said because of her age, figured maybe her memory wasn't reliable anymore, but she was sharp as a tack right up until the end. According to Robert's recollection of his aunt's memories, Mrs. Whitfield had been tending her flower garden on the afternoon of July 23, 1965, when she noticed Danny Morrison riding his bicycle down Elm Street toward the old logging road. Nothing unusual about that, she had told her nephew years later. She had seen the Morrison boy take that route many times before, but about 10 minutes after Danny passed her house, Mrs. Whitfield had looked up from her gardening to see a dark-colored sedan parked at the entrance to the logging road. The car had out-of-state license plates, though she couldn't remember which state, and it looked out of place in their quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's vehicles. More significantly, she had seen Danny Morrison standing beside the car, leaning down to talk to whoever was inside through the driver's side window. The conversation appeared friendly, not threatening, which was why Mrs. Whitfield hadn't thought much about it at the time. Danny was a popular, outgoing boy who could strike up a conversation with anyone, she said. Danny seemed to know whoever was in that car, Robert continued, his voice growing softer as he struggled to remember details from conversations that had taken place decades earlier. He wasn't acting scared or nervous, just talking like he was catching up with someone he recognized. The implications of this revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. If Mrs. Whitfield's memory was accurate, then Danny Morrison hadn't simply ridden his bicycle into the wilderness and vanished. He had encountered someone he knew, someone who had gained his trust enough to engage him in what appeared to be a friendly conversation. Lieutenant Barnes immediately began searching for other residents who might have witnessed the same encounter or noticed the unfamiliar sedan. The renewed investigation prompted several other longtime residents to come forward with their own suppressed memories and observations. Martha Peterson, who had been in her 40s in 1965 and was now in her 80s, remembered seeing an out-of-state car parked near the town center earlier that same day. She had noticed it because it was blocking her usual parking spot in front of the post office, forcing her to park farther away when she went to collect her mail. It was a dark blue or black sedan, she told investigators, her memory surprisingly clear despite the passage of 4 decades. New York plates, I think, though I can't be sure. The driver was sitting inside reading a newspaper, like he was waiting for someone. Even more disturbing was the testimony of James Riley, who had been 12 years old in 1965 and was now a middle-aged man living in the next county. He had never spoken about what he witnessed on July 23rd because no one had ever asked him, And by the time he was old enough to understand the significance of what he had seen, the active investigation had been closed. "I was fishing down by Miller's Creek that afternoon," Riley told investigators during a recorded interview. "I saw a man walking back from the direction of the lake, maybe around 4 o'clock or 4:30. He was carrying something heavy, looked like he was struggling with it. When he saw me watching, he waved and smiled, real friendly-like, but something about it gave me the creeps." The man Riley described had been middle-aged, well-dressed, and driving a dark sedan that matched the descriptions provided by other witnesses. Most significantly, he had been walking back from the direction of Miller's Lake during the time frame when Danny Morrison should have been meeting his friends for their planned afternoon of swimming and bicycle tricks. These new testimonies painted a picture that was both clearer and more troubling than anything investigators had uncovered in 1965. Danny Morrison had encountered someone he knew or trusted, someone who had driven to Millbrook from out of state specifically to find him. The friendly conversation, Mrs. Whitfield had witnessed, was likely the last time anyone saw Danny Morrison alive. The dark sedan with out-of-state plates became the focus of Lieutenant Barnes's investigation, a tangible clue that might finally lead to answers about what had happened to Millbrook's missing boy 40 years earlier. Barnes began with a list no one had built in 1965. The names of men who came and went with the highway crews, men who rented rooms by the week, paid in cash, and left traces. He walked Main Street with a notebook, spoke to owners who remembered the heat and the dust, and asked the same question: who worked here then? Who kept to himself? Who caused trouble? Little by little, one name rose: Carl Brennan, in town today. The crews for the new state road rolled in early that summer. Trucks rattled windows and graders chewed the ridge above the lake. The men were strangers, and after a week the town looked away. A retired foreman met him in a shed that smelled of oil and rain, and tipped a coffee tin of pay stubs onto a bench. He sorted the slips, then tapped one. "Brennan," he said, "machine operator, quick with the controls and quicker with his temper." He told Barnes he had fired the man days before Danny disappeared, after a fight over a late shift and a broken grader. Brennan left in a dark mood, and no one saw him the next morning. Paper trails were scarce, but some held. At the county yard, a clerk found a maintenance log for a crane winch. Ink faded to the color of tea. Chain replaced in mid-July, billed to the project. Barnes pictured the chain pulled from the lake around the blue frame. In a shoebox of motel ledgers, he found Brennan in a tight hand, 2 weeks in July, room noted, cash each night. Once the name was spoken, more doors opened. A waitress remembered a tall man who watched the door more than his plate. A tire shop owner recalled selling heavy toe chain in hot weather, because the buyer asked for the strongest they carried. A boy from that summer said a dark sedan with out-of-state plates idled near the post office, the driver turning his face away when someone looked too long. Barnes pulled thin files from towns along the route, small places with small papers, and a pattern rose like a bruise under light. A child missing by a river in 1963, a boy taken after a fair in 1964, a girl who never reached home in late summer of 1966. In each place, a work crew passed through. In each place, someone remembered a man who liked to be near the water at night, and in one report, a deputy underlined the name Brennan. He wrote the facts in clean lines, not enough for a warrant, enough for a hard look. An angry man, a job lost, a dark car that did not belong, a chain bought when no one needed chains, and a boy on a blue bicycle who never made it to the lake. Barnes closed his notebook and faced the water, and the town held its breath. Barnes knew that chasing Carl Brennan's shadow would never be easy, and each day that passed made the trail colder. Brennan had left Millbrook in the summer of 1965, after being dismissed from the highway project, and from that point his life became a series of short stops in towns that barely remembered him. He took work where machines were needed: bulldozers, graders, cranes, anything that paid in cash, and asked few questions. His record was thin, but whispers remained, and when Barnes pressed old files together, the picture that formed was darker than anyone had feared. In the winter of 1963, a boy vanished from a riverbank near Olean, a boy who had been fishing with friends until he decided to head home alone. Witnesses told police that a road crew had been working near the river that month, and among the workers was a man who drove a dark sedan and kept to himself. The investigation went nowhere, but the file listed the name Brennan as one of the men questioned. He had given an alibi that no one could fully check, and the case was filed away without charges. 2 years later, in the late summer of 1965, Danny Morrison disappeared from Millbrook, and Brennan was once again nearby. When Barnes set the files side by side, he saw the connection that no one had made before, a man whose work put him in place after place, always for just long enough to know the rhythms of a town, to watch its children, to find the moment when someone was alone. In the spring of 1966, in another small town north of Syracuse, a girl failed to return home after visiting the store for bread and milk. The sheriff's office conducted a wide search, found her bicycle abandoned in a field, and collected statements about strangers seen in the area. One description mentioned a man with thick arms and a rough voice who had been working construction on the new bypass. His name was Carl Brennan. Again, no charges were filed, and again the file was placed in the drawer with all the other unsolved cases. The last mention came in the autumn of 1968, when a teenage boy vanished outside Elmira. He had been walking home from a football game, and his route took him past a road project where heavy machinery sat silent in the night. Investigators questioned dozens of workers, and Brennan's name surfaced yet again. By then, he was 37 years old, with a reputation for anger and for drifting from job to job. Nothing tied him directly to the boy, but his presence alone marked another terrible coincidence. Barnes tracked the trail as far as 1978, when Carl Brennan died in a car accident on a rural road in Pennsylvania. The report said he had been drinking, that his car crossed the center line and struck a truck head-on. He was buried in an unmarked grave, leaving behind no family and no answers. For Barnes and for Millbrook, the death felt like the closing of a door, shutting away secrets that would never be spoken. The pattern was there, the timing was clear, but after so many years proof had withered into shadows. The search of Miller's Lake began in the late summer of 2005, with a sense of determination that had not existed in Millbrook for 40 years. The discovery of Danny's bicycle had changed everything, proving that someone had gone to great lengths to hide the truth beneath the water. Divers from the community club returned day after day, working in tight patterns, pushing deeper into the lake's hidden places. What had once seemed like a peaceful body of water now felt like a grave, each dark corner and rocky shelf holding the possibility of answers. The lake was larger and more complicated than anyone had believed in 1965. The old search had skimmed only the shallow edges, relying on hooks and chains, but the new team had modern equipment. They used sonar to map the bottom and discovered a network of ledges and crevices carved by glaciers long ago. At first they found only the usual debris, anchors lost by fishermen, bottles covered in algae, even a rusted rowboat that had sunk decades earlier. But as they pushed toward the northern end of the lake, the sonar revealed something different, a hollow beneath the rocks that extended deeper than expected. It was in early September when two divers reached the entrance to that submerged cave. The opening was narrow, framed by jagged stone, and hidden behind weeds that had swayed like curtains for decades. Inside, the light from their torches cut through water that had never been disturbed by swimmers or boats. Silt hung in clouds as they moved slowly forward, their breaths loud in the silence. Then, they saw it. At first, it looked like a bundle of fabric wedged against the rock wall, but as the divers drew closer, the shape became unmistakable. When the remains were lifted from the water, silence fell across the shore. After 40 years, Danny Morrison had been found. His bones were fragile, wrapped in what was left of his clothing, the fabric faded, but still holding the outline of a boy who had once ridden his bicycle through Millbrook's streets. With him were smaller pieces, a belt buckle, the rusted teeth of a zipper, and fragments that told investigators he had been placed in the cave deliberately. Forensic experts confirmed what the divers already knew. Danny had died soon after he vanished, likely within hours of leaving home that July afternoon. There were marks on the bones that suggested violence, evidence that he had been struck and left with no chance of survival. The bicycle found earlier had been weighted and dropped into the lake, but his body had been hidden even more carefully, pushed into the cave where no one would think to search. Whoever had done it had wanted him to disappear forever, to erase him from the world as if he had never lived. For Susan Martinez, standing on the shore as investigators carried the evidence away, the discovery was both crushing and necessary. The hope she had clung to since childhood dissolved, replaced by the certainty of death, yet the truth gave her something she had never had, an end to the wondering. Danny's story would no longer be that of a boy who vanished without trace, but of a brother whose remains had come home. The funeral of Danny Morrison was held on a cool September morning in the year 2005. 40 years after the day he vanished. The church in Millbrook was filled with people who had grown older, carrying the weight of the mystery, some with gray hair and others with canes, yet all of them still remembering the smiling boy on his blue bicycle. The wooden pews creaked as neighbors, classmates, and children of those who had once searched for Danny took their seats. The air carried the scent of lilies, and the old church bell rang with the same solemn tone it had used for generations. It was not just the funeral of a boy who had been lost, but of a story that had haunted the town for 4 decades. Susan Martinez sat in the front row with her children on either side, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were pale. She had been 12 when her brother disappeared, and now she was nearly 50, yet the grief had never left her. As the casket was carried down the aisle, she felt her body tremble with both sorrow and relief. For the first time since 1965, Danny was not lost, not hidden in the silence of unanswered questions, but present, honored, and remembered. The service was simple, led by Pastor Williams, who had been a young minister when Danny first went missing. His voice cracked as he spoke of the boy who had once been the pride of Millbrook, the son who had been loved so deeply, and the community that had been scarred by his absence. He reminded them that grief can last a lifetime, but so too can love, and that by gathering together, they were finally able to give Danny the farewell he had been denied. When the casket was lowered into the ground at the small cemetery on the edge of town, the sun broke through a bank of clouds, casting golden light across the rows of stones. Susan placed her hand on the cool earth, whispering words no one else could hear. She thought of the last morning she had seen her brother, his promise to be home for dinner, and the silence that had followed. She thought of the years her parents had carried their pain until it consumed them, of her own children who now understood why their mother had carried a shadow in her heart for so long. Carl Brennan's name was never spoken at the funeral, but his presence lingered in every conversation. Investigators had concluded that he remained the most likely suspect, a man with a violent past who had died in 1978, taking his secrets with him. The case would stay open on paper, but in truth the answers were buried with him. What remained was the knowledge of how one man's cruelty had broken not just a family, but an entire town. As mourners drifted away from the graveside, Susan stood a little longer, feeling the peace that came not from forgetting, but from finally knowing. Danny's story would always be tragic, yet now it had an ending. Silence had been replaced with truth, and though the truth was painful, it carried the first fragile steps toward healing.